My name is Savannah Blake, and I found out my mother had died from a Facebook post. No phone call, no message, just a photo of her casket with words of remembrance. And my name missing from the obituary. That day, I stood outside the cemetery gate in silence, watching as my sister called over security to escort me away, like I never belonged to that family at all. Have you ever been pushed out of the very place you once called home? Stripped of your right to grieve just because they decided you weren't worth mourning? If this story touches something in you, feel free to leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and share the video. Someone out there might need to know they're not alone. And if you think I simply turned my back and walked away, no. That was just the moment I began to return. I don't remember how long I stood outside that cemetery gate. I just remember gripping a black scarf in my hand, my eyes locked on the casket as it was slowly lowered into the ground. Too close for a stranger. Too far for a daughter. I didn't cry. Maybe because I'd run out of tears a long time ago. On the night I was kicked out of the house at 17, by the same mother now lying silently beneath that earth. She had once been my whole world, until I realized that, in her eyes, the world only had room for one daughter. Harper. I'd always been the difficult child, my father's words, not mine. It wasn't that I tried to rebel, I just never managed to shrink myself small enough to fit the mold they laid out. I loved to draw, loved the sound of rain on the porch roof, and asked questions no one in my family wanted to answer. Harper, on the other hand, Harper was born to please. Golden curls, bright smile, top of her class, polite, sweet, never ruffled a single feather at family gatherings. I still remember a winter day when I was 8. The snow was heavy outside, and I accidentally dropped Mom's favorite glass teapot while trying to pour her some warm water. The crash echoed through the freezing kitchen. Dad stormed in, yelling, "Savannah! Why are you always so clumsy? Why can't you be more like Harper?" Harper was quietly coloring at the dining table. She didn't look up, but I knew she heard everything. I never blamed her. When love comes easily, why would a child notice who's being left out? Over time, every holiday, every special occasion, every compliment, every tender glance was directed toward Harper. What did I get? "She's hard to manage," Mom would say if anyone asked about me. Or worse, "She's had problems since she was little." They didn't say it to my face, but I heard them. I heard everything. Children aren't deaf, they just haven't figured out how to react yet. The Christmas when I was 12, Harper got an American Girl doll set worth hundreds of dollars, complete with a wardrobe, a house, even a pet. Me? I got a notebook from the dollar store and a box of faded colored pencils. "You like drawing," Mom said. She was right, I did like drawing. But I also liked feeling loved, just like my sister was. As I grew older, the gap widened. Harper took ballet lessons, and Mom took a whole week off work to sew her costumes. I won first place at a statewide art competition, and Mom texted me, "Nice job, don't forget dinner." By high school, I started to resent myself for still hoping they'd change. I studied hard, joined the science club, worked at the library, trying to earn a glance, a nod, the kind of look Harper always got without effort. But the harder I tried, the more invisible I felt. Then came that night. The night I was thrown out. That day, Harper discovered that money was missing from her scholarship fund. $15,000, money she'd planned to use for her dream college. The house turned upside down in minutes. Mom screamed, Dad called the cops, and I was dragged from my room with my backpack half-zipped. I tried to explain I didn't know anything, hadn't touched a cent, that maybe her account had been hacked. No one listened. Harper just stood there, teary-eyed, silent. She didn't say a word in my defense. The police couldn't find enough evidence to press charges, but Dad had made up his mind. "From now on, you're no daughter of mine," he said. in front of Mom, Harper, and the two neighbors who had come out to see the commotion. I don't remember leaving that house. I remember the rain, my soaked clothes, and that I had nowhere to go. I lived in my car for almost a year, worked wherever I could, coffee shops, warehouses, any place that paid cash and didn't ask questions. I ate ramen in parking lots, showered at gas stations, and slept with a folding knife in my jacket pocket. One winter night, my car broke down on the outskirts of St. Louis, and I had to sleep in an abandoned storage unit. My hands were so cold, I couldn't even hold a lighter. I almost gave up. Almost. But one day, while cleaning the back room of a thrift store, I found an old letter tucked inside a dusty book. It was handwritten and said, "If they won't give you a seat at the table, build your own kingdom." I don't know who wrote it, but those words pulled me back to my feet. When I turned 21, a lawyer came looking for me with a wooden box. It was from my grandmother, Lucille, the only one who ever held me without judgment. Inside was the deed to a small, overgrown plot of land in rural Missouri, a worn notebook filled with herbal remedies, and a note. "Savannah, you carry the blood of those who rebuild. The world may forget you, but you must never forget yourself." I didn't cry when I read that letter, but I knew I had to begin again, right where everything had ended. So, from that patch of dry land, I began to rebuild my life. No headlines, no helping hands. But this time, I didn't need permission to exist. And I certainly didn't need anyone to validate my worth. When I first started clearing the land Lucille had left me, no one believed I'd amount to anything. Even I wasn't sure what I was doing. It was just over an acre, tucked in a rural pocket near the Missouri-Kansas border. Dry soil, waist-high weeds, a few old trees, a collapsing shed, and a rusted water tank. But to me, it was the first thing in my life that belonged solely to me. Land no one could take away. No one could erase my name from. I spent weeks cleaning that land, pulling out dry roots with my bare hands, turning soil with an old $5 shovel I'd bought at a flea market. Sleepless nights in the cold shed, I'd opened Grandma's notebook. She'd written detailed recipes for soaps, essential oils, and healing balms using local herbs. Wild lavender, chamomile, mint, mugwort. These weren't just instructions. They were a living legacy. I began recreating each formula. First came handmade soaps, then heroines, then bath salts. I rebuilt the shed into a small production space. No lab, no expensive gear. Just me, an old cast iron pot, a cheap digital scale, and sheer determination. Each morning, I'd water the herbs, harvest them, dry them in the sun. At night, I took free online classes in basic biology on Coursera, on YouTube, anything I could find. I learned about skin reactions, pH balance, allergies, cell structure. All the things that once seemed out of reach to a girl who had to choose between gas and dinner now became the foundation I stood on. A year later, I opened a tiny Etsy shop called Lucille Botanicals, named after the only woman who ever truly saw me. I drew the logo myself, took product photos with an old phone. I sent samples to wellness bloggers. Some ignored me. One mom of 3 wrote a glowing review. "This hair oil reminds me of my grandmother," she wrote. "Gentle, silky, honest." Orders started coming in. First, slowly, and then all at once. I stayed up 3 nights straight to keep up. I hired a neighbor's teenage daughter to help label and pack. It felt like a dream. Not because of the money, but because for the first time in my life, someone praised what I made. Not because of who I was related to, not for grades or looks, but for what I created with my own hands. Still, even small success has its cost. One afternoon, as I was cutting lavender, my phone rang. A number from Louisville. I almost didn't answer. But the voice stopped me cold. "Savannah?" It was Harper. I thought I misheard. Almost 8 years had passed since the night I was kicked out. We hadn't spoken since. Just silence. I kept my voice calm. "It's me, what's going on?" She hesitated for a long time, then said, voice tight, "Can you come back to Louisville? Dad's in serious trouble. Our family needs your help." I gave a dry laugh, not bothering to hide the sarcasm. "Family? Or just my name on a pile of forged documents your father used?" "You found out?" Harper asked softly. No excuses, no detours. "Yeah. The tax attorney called me 2 months ago." Quite the twist. Dad used my name to set up 3 shell companies, opened offshore accounts, evaded taxes. Then I suddenly got a letter from the IRS. Harper let out a breath. "Dad was wrong, but if you don't sign the settlement documents, the company will get frozen. The whole family will lose everything." I cut her off, voice cold as ice. "What family? Do you know how many nights I slept in a car? Do you know what your dad, our dad, said to me that day? You're no longer my daughter." "So now, suddenly it's the whole family?" Harper's voice cracked. "I know, I was wrong, but I didn't think you'd actually disappear. I thought you'd come back eventually, like all the other times." That sentence stabbed me straight in the chest. "So you didn't think I was strong enough to survive without home? Well, you were wrong. I lived, I survived, I grew, I stood tall, without anyone." Harper said nothing. Maybe she was crying, maybe she was angry. But I didn't feel anger anymore. There was just one clear realization. This time, the balance had shifted. I hung up after saying one thing. If Dad really needs me, then he'd better be ready to pay the price. That night, I sat alone in my workshop, staring at the golden light reflecting off the rows of essential oil bottles. I thought about all the years I believed I was invisible. And I realized some mistakes others make, if wielded the right way, can become the ladder that lifts you to places they never dared to imagine. 3 days after that call, I drove back to Louisville, the place that once held my deepest wounds, now the launch point of a new kind of reckoning. I spent nearly 8 hours behind the wheel, driving through the autumn foliage, my mind tangled in thought. There was a part of me that wanted to turn back every time I passed a road leading west. But I kept going. Not because they deserved it, but because I needed to finish what had started, nearly a decade ago. I pulled up in front of Douglas and Blake LLP, a name still etched on the sign even though half of it had long been cut from their actual lives. The glass doors no longer gleamed, and the brass plaque in the foyer had dulled with time. What once stood as a symbol of success now looked like a ghost, tired, faded, and drained. Harper met me at the entrance, wearing a suit with slightly wrinkled cuffs, stripped of any shine she once had. As I walked in, no handshake, no hug, just a nod. She led me into the conference room where my father was already seated beside a man I assumed was their attorney. He stood when I entered, his face unable to mask his surprise. Maybe it was because I actually came, or maybe because I was no longer the lost daughter he remembered. "Savannah," he said, his voice still laced with familiar arrogance, "thank you for coming." "I'm here because my name got dragged into this mess," I replied, deliberately using the most distant tone possible. Harper sat down quietly and opened a folder on the table. The attorney, a gray-haired man named Gerald, began to explain. I listened just long enough to understand the core of it. My father had set up 3 shell companies under my name and Grandma Lucille's to hide corporate income from the IRS over the past 7 years. All the documents were forged, real information, fake signatures, no consent. My throat went dry as I looked through the fakes. "You forged my handwriting, and this." I pointed at a copy of Grandma Lucille's old ID. "She died nearly a year before this was signed." Gerald lowered his head. "I wasn't aware of that. I only handled the document processing once it was passed along by Mr. Douglas." "And I was part of that processing?" I turned to my father. Upon, he said nothing, just silence. No apology, no explanation, not even a flicker of real remorse. I took a deep breath. I'll sign the required documents. But on one condition, I want full legal ownership of the companies listed under my name. Harper jolted. You want to take over Douglas and Blake? I don't want the name, I corrected her. I want legal control over every asset and operation tied to the 3 companies that used my name, including contracts, licenses, physical property, and all bank accounts. My father shot up from his chair. Are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea what you're asking for? I stood up, pulled a stack of papers from my bag. I have copies of every single transaction linked to those tax evasion accounts under my name. I also have a letter from the IRS inviting me to assist in a potential criminal investigation. But I don't want to send you to prison. I want back what you stole using my name without my permission. Harper's face went pale. My father sank into his chair. Gerald raised a hand to interject. Miss Blake, if I may suggest. I cut him off, my eyes locked on my father's. There are no more suggestions. I didn't come here to negotiate. I came to close the book. A heavy silence hung in the air, like a slit that wouldn't stop bleeding. Finally, my father closed his eyes. Fine, he murmured. Do it. But don't say I didn't warn you. You won't be able to run something you don't understand. I smirked. You forget I've built a business from nothing but dirt and herbs. What you built was a sandcastle stacked on forged paper. The transfer of ownership happened a week later. I hired my own legal team, using the very illegal loopholes from their own records to force a full handover. In return, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges, though the IRS might still pursue its own if it uncovers forged documents tied to a deceased estate. I became the new operator, not the way my father once envisioned it. But by mastering the very rules of the game, he thought I was too weak to learn. The day I signed the final document, Harper waited for me in the hallway. She stared at me, unblinking. You don't hate us? I looked straight into her eyes, no longer filled with pride, but with fear. Hate? No. Hate is a luxury I left behind a long time ago. All I have now is focus. What are you going to do with the company? She asked quietly. I gave a faint smile, stepped past her, and said nothing. Because honestly, I didn't know yet. But I knew this much. I had reclaimed my seat, not in the family, but at the table. And this time, I wasn't the one being sacrificed. I returned to Missouri after more than 10 days, surrounded by spreadsheets, contracts, and suspicious stares inside the office I had just taken over. Driving home, I didn't listen to music like usual. I turned off the radio, rolled down the windows, and let the late autumn wind tangle my hair, as if to blow off the stale air of Louisville still clinging to my skin. As soon as I got back to the workshop, I tossed off my coat, rolled up my sleeves, and headed straight for the raw ingredient storage. The chamomile had dried. The peppermint oil batch was just enough for the next order. I sat down at my work table, pulled up my familiar chair, and placed both hands on the scarred wood. That grounding feeling I hadn't felt in days. Here, I was myself. No blazers. No legal jargon. No commercial clauses. Just Savannah. And honest work. But that peace didn't last long. 3 days later, just as I'd finished packing the last order, a message popped up from the logistics coordinator. There's an issue with the weekly report. The October order still hasn't been paid on Amazon's end. I frowned. That was our biggest invoice of the month, and Amazon being late? That had never happened before. I logged into the seller account, double-checked the data, and scrolled through the support emails. Strangely, the account had been flagged and temporarily suspended. The reason? Alleged product quality violations, according to feedback from a customer. I checked the review. A user named rclark78 had posted a full-page write-up. Severe allergic reaction. Scent seems artificial. Suspicious of reused ingredients. Complete with a photo showing an inflamed rash and a medical slip. I froze. This wasn't just negative feedback. This was the kind of incident that could bury a small brand I had fought so hard to build. I started investigating. The batch was from September. I still had a bottle from that lot. I retested the ingredients, went through the process. Nothing abnormal. I contacted other customers who had ordered from the same batch. They all responded positively. No allergic reactions, no complaints. Something didn't add up. Using a cybersecurity tool a friend once showed me, I traced the IP address of rclark78. The location? Louisville, Kentucky. A chill ran through my stomach. Then, like a thread pulling loose from memory, it hit me. Clark. Rachel Clark. My father's longtime personal assistant, the woman he once trusted with all the back-end affairs of his firm. I sat in silence in the darkened workshop, back resting against the door, eyes fixed on the yellowing trees in the yard. They wanted me to fail. Even after signing over the company, after granting full rights, after staying silent about the fraud, they still couldn't stand that I survived. And worse, that I thrived. The next morning, I contacted my attorney. After a few hours of digital digging, his team confirmed the rclark78 account had been created just 1 week before the review was posted, and the IP matched servers that had previously accessed Douglas and Blake's internal systems. From a legal standpoint, this was identity fraud and intentional economic sabotage. I didn't sue. Not yet. I chose a different route. I sent the full investigation report to Amazon's PR department, along with photos documenting my production process, letters from satisfied customers, and a third-party lab's product certification. I requested an in-person meeting. 3 days later, I was sitting at their regional office in Kansas City. The manager, a woman named Sarah Whitmore, looked at me after reviewing the file. "You're not the kind of person who gets pushed off the track easily, are you?" I gave her a tired smile. "I don't have a reverse gear. I only go forward." Sarah reinstated my account, issued an official apology, and offered PR support to clarify the issue. That very evening, I posted a heartfelt article on Lucille Botanical's homepage, sharing the whole story, not just the order issue, but the journey from a broken-down car to a tiny workshop, and why I never gave up, even after being erased by my own family. The post spread faster than I expected, not because of drama, but because anyone who's ever been dismissed or erased by their own blood knows the feeling of getting stomped on the moment you try to stand. A few days later, an elderly woman with a delicate frame and silver hair knocked on my workshop door. She was holding one of my jars of hand cream. "You must be Savannah," she said, her voice as soft as wind blowing through harp strings. I nodded. This cream calmed my hands after 10 years of medications that never worked. "But that's not why I'm here." She paused. "I own a chain of organic product stores down south, and I believe your product deserves to be there." I looked at her, stunned. Not because of a business opportunity, but because of validation. Coming from a total stranger based solely on something I had built with my own hands. That day, I understood something. When you plant with clean roots, the tree grows on its own. Even if someone tries to stir storms or trample the soil, what's nurtured with truth and grit will still bloom. I thought things were settling down after the Amazon ordeal. But life always seems to add one more minor chord when you're just about to hit a high note. One chilly morning in mid-November, as I was checking our first batch of cold-pressed peppermint oil for the season, my phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was familiar. Louisville. I picked up and my chest tightened at the voice on the other end. It was Harper. Her voice was small and shaky, nothing like the composed or cold tone I remembered. "Savannah, do you have a few minutes to talk?" I wiped my hands on my apron, stepped outside the workshop, and sat on the worn wooden steps beneath the porch. The air was crisp and the lavender in the garden swayed gently in the wind. "I'm listening." Dad's in the hospital, she whispered. It's his heart. This time, it might be serious. I didn't respond right away. On the other end, Harper waited patiently. Finally, I said, I hope he finds peace, even if I'm not sure he ever wished the same for me. Harper didn't argue, didn't apologize, didn't try to convince me. She was quiet for a long moment and then she said something that caught me completely off guard. I just came back from your office. I saw how you've changed things. I saw the differences, and I think I understand why now. I never knew everything you went through. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind brushing through the trees. Maybe she was being sincere. Maybe she was finally seeing me. I never needed pity, Harper, I said slowly. I just wanted to be seen, for real. I know, she whispered. And now I do. And I have something else to tell you. I opened my eyes. Her voice was a little shaky. I've left the company. I don't want to be part of a system I no longer believe in. I've started learning about organic products, and if you'll allow it, I'd like to come to Missouri. I want to learn how you built all of this. I could barely believe what I was hearing. Harper, the golden child, the girl who had everything handed to her, who lived in a perfect shell our parents crafted, was now speaking to me with a humility I had never heard before. I'm not a teacher, I said after a moment of silence. I'm just someone who got knocked down and had to learn how to stand on her own. That's exactly why I want to learn from you, Harper replied instantly. I didn't promise anything, but I didn't say no either. 3 days later, Harper showed up at my gate with a small suitcase, a thick coat, and mud-caked shoes. No more polish, no more makeup, no more condescending glances. Just Harper. My real sister. Perhaps for the first time, I truly saw her. That first morning, she fumbled with the hose and spilled a whole bucket of water on her feet. I nearly laughed when she jumped from the cold. But instead of snapping like she used to, she wiped her legs dry and asked me, "Do we plant the lavender in rows or clusters, sis?" I pointed toward the west plot, in rows but staggered so the light spreads evenly. She nodded and started digging. Those soft hands of hers were finally getting dirt under the nails. In the days that followed, I taught her how to sort herbs, how to check leaf moisture, how to recognize pure essential oil by the base note. Harper took meticulous notes in a little notebook. I saw a younger version of myself in the slanted strokes of her handwriting. One evening, while we were peeling chamomile blossoms for drying, Harper quietly said, "When we were kids, I used to sneak peeks at you drawing in the backyard. You always drew with your left hand, but your lines were so steady. I remember once you drew Mom arranging flowers. That sketch, I kept it, still have it." I turned to look at her. Harper lowered her gaze, her fingers still gently plucking petals. "I knew back then you had something I didn't, but instead of admiring it, I got jealous. Because I thought if I wasn't perfect, Mom and Dad wouldn't see me the way they saw you that day." I froze. The story we'd always told ourselves about favoritism, it turned out, was really about two kids who were never loved the right way. I placed my hand on hers. No one should have to trade love for recognition. Harper nodded, eyes rimmed red. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in years. I wrote, "Some wounds can't be erased, but they can be buried under healing soil. My sister has started to replant what had long gone barren between us. Maybe family isn't blood. Maybe it's the choice to rebuild together what we thought was dead. If you've ever been hurt by someone close to you, but one day they return with empty hands, no excuses, just a plea for a second chance, what would you do?" Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if my story reminded you of a piece of your own, don't forget to like and follow the channel so we can keep walking this journey together. Because there's still so much left unsaid, and a new chapter waiting just ahead. The day I officially became the legal owner of the 3 companies my father once ruled, the whole city of Louisville seemed to fall silent. Not because they didn't know, but because no one believed I would dare. Me? The daughter who was kicked out? Who once slept in her car with 2 coins in her pocket? Who was erased from her own mother's obituary? Was now the final signature on the transfer of power my father once clutched like life itself. I didn't walk into that office seeking vengeance or grandeur. I wore a plain white shirt, my hair tied back, and carried a folder I compiled myself. I didn't need someone to open the door for me or an assistant trailing behind. I only needed one thing: the silence of the conference room when I walked in and the looks on the faces of my father's former colleagues, the ones who turned away when he erased me from his world. Harper came with me that day. She sat quietly beside me, flipping through each page as if she too needed to see the words to believe they were real. During the entire meeting, I never brought up my father's misconduct. I didn't accuse, I didn't threaten, I didn't gloat about what I could do if I wanted. I simply said, I'm not continuing his legacy. I'm not walking his path. I'm rebuilding from the inside out. I fired 3 top finance executives, the ones who had quietly signed off on the tax evasion transfers. I kept the legal team but demanded an independent audit. I consolidated smaller offices into one main location, cut unnecessary costs, and announced a new direction for the company: legal support for small businesses. The very kind I once desperately needed. Some people scoffed. Some whispered that I was delusional with a savior complex. I didn't argue. I let results speak. 3 weeks later, I launched the Safe Start Initiative, a 6-month legal support package for solo women entrepreneurs, especially those who had survived domestic violence, faced gender-based financial discrimination, or been overlooked by traditional banks. The program went live on the homepage of the newly renamed firm Lucille Legal and Business Solutions. Anyone who knew my grandmother would understand why that name was chosen. From a firm once catering to the elite, I turned it into a place where people like the old me could walk in without feeling small. 1 month later, I hosted a modest conference inviting local journalists, nonprofits, and potential clients. Nothing flashy, no glamorous backdrops, just a simple meeting room with wooden walls and a whiteboard that read, "Justice doesn't begin with power. It begins with courage." As I stepped up to the podium, I saw my father standing in the back row, leaning against the wall. He wore a long coat, his hair more gray than I remembered, his eyes no longer sharp but unsettled. He didn't sit. He didn't leave. I didn't mention him in my speech. I didn't even mention myself. I spoke about women denied business loans for lack of a male guarantor, about single mothers who couldn't afford lawyers to fight for custody, about people like Lucille, who left behind a piece of land and a single note that ended up saving someone's entire life. And I ended with this: not everyone needs someone to go ahead of them, but everyone needs someone who believes they can keep going. As I stepped down, Harper lightly touched my hand. "You just left the whole room speechless," she whispered. I smiled. Not out of pride, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't have to fight to be acknowledged. I just did the right thing. And sometimes, that's loud enough. After the conference, many came to shake hands, exchange contacts, propose collaborations. While I was speaking with a representative from a nonprofit, I noticed my father was still there. Still hadn't left. Finally, when no one else stood between us, he approached. "Savannah," he said, his voice low and hoarse, like a man unused to speaking. "I thought you'd come back to tear it all down." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. At the man who used to be the center of my world, now shrunken inside his oversized coat, eyes unsure. "I did come back," I replied, "but not to destroy. I came back to build something you never could. Trust." He lowered his head. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he said, "because I know I don't deserve it. But if your mother were still alive, she'd be proud." That sentence made me freeze. I didn't know if he meant it or if it was a last-ditch effort for redemption, but I didn't need to know. I didn't need more apologies or late remorse. Is nodded. If Mom were still here, maybe she wouldn't have let you hurt me like that. He stood still, then stepped back as if he understood there was nothing more to say. And just like that, he walked away. Not because I was abandoned, but because he no longer had the right to stay. I returned to the office, removed the Douglas and Blake plaque from the old frame, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it in a drawer like an artifact. I didn't erase the past. I just didn't let it take up space in the present. The next day, when I came back to Missouri, Harper was waiting on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea. She smiled softly. "Welcome back, boss, to the land that's truly yours." I didn't say anything. I sat down and looked out at the garden, where the lavender plants were budding for the second time that season. Sometimes, the things that seem impossible just need one person willing to start again and not stop halfway. A little over a month after the Louisville office conference, I hosted a small gathering in Missouri to honor the people who had stood by Lucille Botanicals since the very beginning. It wasn't anything formal, just a warm garden party during the final lavender harvest, with a long wooden table, warm baked goods, chamomile tea steeped by hand, and a few strands of soft, golden lights glowing in the gentle December dusk. I invited Zoe, the first friend who helped me label oil jars with ink-stained fingers back when I was still working out of a makeshift garage, and Miss Martinez, my old community college teacher who secretly pitched in to help me buy my first oil press. A few longtime customers were there too, folks who had bought from me when I only had 5 products, now close friends. And of course, Harper was there, helping me arrange cookies on trays like she'd been here from the start. I stood in the middle of the small yard, a cup of ginger tea in hand, and looked around. Not a single person here had ever been begged to stay. They chose to, because they saw value in me back when I thought I had none. As the evening grew quieter, Harper gave me a wink and pulled a folded sheet of paper from her coat pocket. "You stay right here. My turn on stage," she joked. Everyone chuckled, thinking she was just being playful. But then she stepped in front of the table and cleared her throat, gently. "I'd like to say a few words," she began, her voice still a little unsure, but her gaze steady. "I'm Harper, Savannah's sister, and before I say anything else, I need to confess something. For the first 20 years of my life, I didn't understand this woman. I lived beside her, shared a house, meals, parents, but I never truly saw who she was." I felt everyone's eyes shift toward me, but Harper continued without hesitation. "When she got kicked out, I stood by. When she disappeared, I stayed silent. When she succeeded, I told myself, she just got lucky. I was wrong at every step, and now I'm standing here not to apologize, because that wouldn't be enough, but to thank her. For not disappearing forever. For not turning her back on me, the way I turned mine on her." No one said a word, just the soft breeze rustling through the now dry mint patch. Harper took a deep breath. "And there's one more thing I want to share. Something many of you might not know. Every single Lucille product you've ever bought, every formula, every label, every order shipped, comes from a woman who once was treated as invisible by her own family. But instead of fading away, she built a place where others could finally see themselves." When she finished, I'm not sure who clapped first, but soon the whole garden filled with applause. Not loud or flashy, more like a gentle pat on the back after a long road. I walked over and hugged her for a long time. Harper whispered, "I'm really proud of you." As the crowd drifted toward the dessert table, Zoe came up and threw an arm over my shoulder. "The same kid who used to hide from group projects just gave a speech like a senator." I smiled. "She's come a long way." "And what about you?" Zoe asked. "Do you feel like you've arrived?" I glanced over at the trees Grandma Lucille once planted. "No. But I think I've stopped running. A week later, I received an invitation from the Midwest Women Entrepreneurs Council. They asked me to be the keynote speaker at their annual event with the theme, Building from What No One Saw. I read that subject line 3 times. Not because I didn't believe it, but because a part of me, even one that had found her footing, still wasn't used to standing in the spotlight. I printed the invitation and pinned it to the corkboard on the wall of my small office next to the kitchen, right beside an old photo of me and Grandma Lucille in front of that long-abandoned shed. She's wearing a thick sweater, holding a cup of tea. I'm clutching a notebook, my face smudged with dirt. We're both smiling. I gently touched the frame. I'll tell the whole story, not for recognition, but so others will know they can begin. From anywhere. When I returned to my desk, Harper had already laid out rows of oil bottles ready for labeling. "Sis," she said, "I think we should create a limited edition batch, inspired by your upcoming speech." "Great idea," I replied. "What would you call it?" Harper winked. "Light from the soil." I paused, then nodded. "Write it down, put that name on the label." And just like that, the things I once buried beneath the ground, the steps I once trampled to keep moving, were now being rewritten on every small jar, every outgoing package, every thank you note from people I'd never met, but who somehow knew me better than anyone in my old house ever did. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because of the birds chirping on the porch or the sunlight slipping through the curtains, but because of a strange feeling in my chest. As if today were special, even if the calendar didn't say so. I brewed a pot of peppermint tea and took it out to the front steps. The steam rose gently, soft and familiar, like an old greeting. I looked toward the lavender field, where Harper was crouched, checking the soil moisture. Under her thick coat, she still had the slightly awkward gait of someone new to manual labor, but her eyes were focused. Harper had been here for nearly 4 months. She was no longer the pampered golden girl from before, but a woman learning how to rebuild herself from the bare earth. We didn't talk much about the past anymore. What needed forgiving had already been laid down in the afternoons watering the fields, the late nights labeling jars under golden light, and the quiet moments when she brought me tea as I worked past time itself. I stood and walked into the small office to prepare for a virtual meeting with the legal team from Louisville. The Safe Start project was entering Phase 2, building a network of legal aid across neighboring states. We'd just partnered with 3 nonprofit organizations in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. As I looked at the map with pins marking our next destinations, I felt like I was slowly expanding a territory no one had ever given me permission to enter. Except me. When the meeting ended, I received an email from the National Startup Forum organizers. They invited me as an honored guest alongside 2 major figures from finance and tech. The topic? Redefining success, from surviving to leading. I sat quietly, staring at the subject line. Then I opened an old letter Zoe had sent me 2 years ago, just after I secured legal ownership of the company from my father. In it, she wrote, "You don't need to go far to do something big. But if the day ever comes that you must step on stage, remember, no one can tell your story better than you." That night, I walked into the workshop, still lit by warm yellow light. One corner had been rearranged by Harper for the new Lucille Mentorship Project, a program to guide young women in launching businesses with modest capital. She sat at the desk, working on a training manual, tapping her fingers on the wood as she paused to think. I said softly, "Harper?" She looked out. "I'm heading to Washington next month. They invited me to speak at the Startup Forum." Harper raised her eyebrows. "How many people will you be speaking to?" "About 2,000. It'll be live-streamed nationwide." She smirked. "And you used to panic giving presentations in front of 12 classmates in high school." I laughed. "I'm still scared." Harper rested her chin in her palm, looking at me. "But you're going, right?" I nodded. "Not for the spotlight, but because there are so many people who've been made to believe they're not worth being heard. I want to be the one to tell them, I get it. and you don't need anyone's permission to exist." Harper didn't say anything else, but as I turned to go, she softly added, "I'll stay home, keep the workshop running, handle the orders, and make the tea each morning the way you like it." I turned back to look at her, feeling a quiet warmth rise inside me. Family no longer felt like a raised scar from years of comparison. It had slowly healed, softened, and become a new layer of skin. Not perfect, but no longer bleeding. Before I left for Washington, I decided to host a gathering in Missouri. Not a conference, not a brand event, just a small farewell for the very people who had shaped Lucille into what it was today. I wanted to see the faces that had walked with me from the first cold winds to the lavender-lit afternoons. Zoe flew in from Texas, Ms. Martinez came with her 2 grandkids. Even Maddie was there, the first customer who once called just to thank me because the essential oil helped her sleep again after losing her husband. And many more. They brought homemade pastries, jars of honey from a nearby farm, and bundles of dried flowers. I built a small stage from old pallets in the backyard and hung a hand-carved wooden sign. "Where you start doesn't decide where you'll end up." I didn't give a big speech, just shared a short story about the day I planted my first mint. The first herb I ever harvested with bare hands, in the rain, with no clue about business. Back then I thought, as long as it survives. Now, I think, as long as I don't give up, any plant will grow. People clapped. Zoe handed me a leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten notes from everyone there. Well wishes, thank yous, a few lines of poetry. I held that notebook like a family heirloom. Harper came up last, taking my place at the guest check-in table. "When you come back," she said, looking straight at me, "I want you to find everything just the way you left it." I smiled. "And I hope you see yourself, not someone else's version of you." Harper nodded. "I'm starting to." I left the backyard as darkness fell, feeling light as if I'd finally taken off an old, worn-out coat. Everyone left with a pouch of tea, a thank you card, and a handwritten note from me. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." I knew the next chapter was close. But I also knew every chapter should be written with gratitude for those who were there from page 1. And that day, I saw every one of them clearly, no longer blurred by old pain. For my trip to Washington, I didn't pack much. Just a small suitcase, a few simple outfits, the leather notebook Harper had given me, and an old photo of me and Grandma Lucille in front of the old shed back when no one believed I could do anything that mattered. I didn't bring flashy banners or a speech crafted by professionals. I just brought my story and a deep quiet that had settled in after years of no longer needing to argue about who was right. The convention hall was grand, with a high ceiling glittering with crystal lights, rows of perfectly aligned chairs, and people in suits pressed to perfection. I wore a soft indigo dress, carrying a canvas tote embroidered with the Lucille Botanicals logo, like a small signal that I was still me, the woman who started again from dry soil, no business card, no backing. The host introduced me with a steady, rehearsed voice like every other professional speech. But when I stepped on stage and looked out at over 1,000 faces waiting for me to speak, I didn't feel the nerves I used to. Instead, I felt light. As if I didn't need to prove anything anymore, just honestly share what brought me here. I began with an image that seemed simple. I once lived in my car during a winter in St. Louis. One night, the temperature dropped to 5 degrees below zero. I didn't have enough gas to run the heater, and I had no one to call. I remember holding my own hands all night, not because of the cold, but because I was afraid that if I let go, I might truly disappear. The room fell still. I let the silence sit for a few seconds, then continued. But here's the strange thing. The next morning, I didn't freeze to death. I woke up, head pounding, hands numb, but I was alive. And from that moment on, I understood if I could survive that night, nothing could hold me down forever. I didn't preach. I didn't give life lessons. I just told stories. About the land my grandma left me. About the first time I dried mint by hand, not knowing if anyone would buy it. About the thrill of receiving my first order. About Harper's call. The papers my father forged in my name, and the nights I typed partnership emails with greasy hands and an aching back. I looked around and saw a middle-aged woman in the second row nodding slowly. An older man behind her placed his hand over his heart. A young woman clutched her folder tightly, eyes unblinking. I ended with something I'd never said out loud before. I'm not extraordinary. I'm just someone who was once pushed aside, but instead of waiting for someone to pull me back, I built a new path. And that path isn't just mine. It's for anyone who's ever been told they weren't good enough, strong enough, or worthy enough. As I stepped off the stage, applause began. Slow, steady, and deeply felt. Like distant drums echoing after the rain. A few days after I returned to Missouri, I received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter, the writing firm but slightly shaky. It was from my father. Savannah, I heard your speech. Not live, but clearly enough to understand. There are things I never had the courage to say. Thank you for not using your strength to destroy, but to build. I'm not asking to be part of your life again, but if one day you need someone to listen, just listen. I'll be there. Uglis. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry as I folded the letter. It wasn't a full apology, nor was it redemption, but it was something. Close to acknowledgement. Closer than ever before. I placed the letter in a small wooden box along with other nameless keepsakes. My grandma's old fountain pen she used for writing formulas, a photo of the first batch of products, the very first label I misspelled when printing, and the scrap of paper where Zoe once scribbled, "You've got this." The next day, Harper found me in the workshop. She was wearing a shirt I'd once forgotten in the closet, holding an envelope. "You just got invited to partner with an organic grocery chain," she said, beaming. "They want the full light from the soil line for the holiday season." I smiled. "Are you going to lead the project?" Harper nodded, then hesitated. "Do you trust me?" I looked at her, not as the sister who once made me cry with a glance, but as a woman who had crossed something no one thought she could. "I do," I said. "Not because you're my sister, but because you've shown you can keep something alive and make it grow." We sat down and divided up the tasks, each with a laptop, a cup of tea, and a renewed belief. The sun was setting, its light streaming through the window, casting shadows of two women, once divided by silence and misunderstanding, now sitting side by side, writing a new chapter from all that had been relearned, re-understood, and re-forgiven. No need for noise, no need for praise, just true. And enough. What do you think about my story? About the cracks in a home that once seemed unfixable? About those who were once abandoned yet chose to walk forward without stepping on others? Who chose to rebuild their lives with trust instead of resentment? I believe that in every family, no matter how broken, there's still a place to return to, if we're brave enough to look back, patient enough to listen, and kind enough to forgive not just others, but ourselves. If this story made you see yourself in some way or reminded you of someone who once left your life, share your thoughts below. I'd truly love to read your story. And if you value honest stories, layered with emotion, about family, fractures, and the quiet miracles that can grow from brokenness, please follow this channel. The next story might just be the piece you've been looking for in your own life.